Greetings, YouTube. I've finally decided on a name for my podcast. No Rares Required. So welcome to No Rares Required, Episode 8, Dimir Draw 2. One of the things that I love about Draft is that the best drafting strategies are based around the commons and uncommons, because these are the cards that you get to see every time. Who needs rares, right? Every week I present a drafting strategy for a different archetype in the current Magic the Gathering set, Brothers War, and today we'll be covering my strategy for drafting Dimir, or Black-Blue. Dimir has been one of my favorite archetypes to draft, especially in Pod, because it takes advantage of some very underappreciated commons and uncommons. My top common is Philology Archaeologist. My strategy for Dimir is similar to Izzet in that I aim to build a deck that is mostly spells that help you draw or cycle through your deck. But instead of a tempo or go wide strategy, I aim to control my opponent and win through card advantage. So playing this out as a 0-3 is even better than an Izzet because you don't have to worry about the loss in tempo. This card also wheels, so it is not difficult to pick up in multiples, and I've found it to be very useful in stopping early pressure from the aggressive decks. My next top tier common that I want as many as I can get is Moment of Defiance. This is also a card that wheels, but the lifelink helps you stabilize and it draws your second card as long as you cast it on your turn. The theme for Dimir in Brothers War is drawing your second card, and I've found Moment of Defiance to be a great way to trigger it. Usually I like a card like Disfigure when I'm in an aggressive deck where it is important to remove my opponent's early blocker, but I've found that since I'm planning on playing cards like Philology Archaeologist, which block well but don't end up removing the enemy's creature, it's nice to have some cheap removal for early in the game. And since you are drawing so many cards, it isn't as detrimental to top deck late in the game, and I'll happily run as many Disfigures as I can get. Gix's Caress is a card that I mentioned in my guide to Golgari. It's a great card to include when you are planning to play a late game strategy, and I like it in Dimir even more than in Golgari, since it combos very nicely with Mightstone animation. It removes your opponent's best card, and it creates a Power Stone. It is also a card that wheels, so picking up multiples is not a problem. In Golgari, I like to run 1 or 2, since you have access to cards like Argothian Opportunist to make Power Stones, but in Dimir, I'll run as many as I can get. Overwhelming Remorse is the best removal in the set, especially the longer the game goes on. It exiles, so it gets rid of annoying unearthed creatures or strategies that aim to reanimate their graveyard. I tend to run a small amount of creatures in Dimir, so this tends to be a bit more expensive to cast compared to Golgari, for example, but it is still the best removal in the set, and I'll take as many as I can get. Boulderbranch Golem may come as a surprise, but it is a Dimir superstar, and I think it performs best in this archetype over any other, and I'll explain why. When you decide to include a 7-cost card, you usually must do so sparingly, because if this is in your opening hand, it is kind of a dead card. Similar to Golgari, I'm building a late-game strategy where this card fits in perfectly. The 6 life is critical to stabilizing in many games, but unlike Golgari, where I aim to play 1 or 2, in Dimir, I'll take as many as I can get my greedy little hands on, and this is because of card draw. With card draw, you don't have to worry about this taking up space in your hand, and you have just as much, or arguably even more, card draw than Izzet. But it works even better than Izzet since you aren't usually going for a tempo or go wide strategy in Dimir. Another late game card that I'll give a mention to is Trench Stalker. It gains lifelink whenever you draw your second card, and is my backup if Boulderbranch Golems aren't available. My last top tier common for Dimir is Combat Courier. It's great as a chump blocker, and it can trigger your draw 2 claws on 2 different turns. Now for my tier 2 commons. These are cards that I think are better than filler, but maybe I don't want to run as many copies, or there are slightly better options for the deck. Mightstone's animation is better in Izzet, where the 4/4 body fits nicely into the tempo strategy, but the card does draw you a card, so it works well in Dimir. And I aim to have some cheap artifacts or power stones. I really like this as a follow-up to a turn 3 Gix's Caress, for example. Desynchronize is a card that I see wheel all of the time. I don't mind running 1 or 2. It is expensive to cast, but putting their best creature on top of their library also blocks their card draw, which is actually quite valuable. I feel like people should come up a little bit on this card, but until they do, I'll happily keep taking it. I like Stern Lesson as kind of an alternative to Gix's Caress. I'd rather be messing with my opponent's hand, but this makes a good turn 3 play, which seems to be somewhat limited in Dimir. Scrapwork Mutt is a good inclusion. There are a couple of uncommons that make me want to splash red in Dimir, but even without the splash, it triggers your second draw clause and is a good inclusion. Scrapwork Cohort is a good inclusion as well, since you have power stones off of cards like Gix's Caress and Stern Lesson. There are also a couple of uncommons that make me want to splash white that we will get into. Similar to Golgari, though, I like this as a defensive card instead of trying to strategize of going wide. My last common is Energy Refractor. It triggers the second draw clause, and as you will see, there are a couple of uncommons that I think are worth splashing in Dimir, and this card is excellent for helping you splash into your deck. My mythic level uncommon for Dimir is Static Net. I've talked about this card in a lot of my guides, and that's because it's the best removal at the uncommon level. You can target any non-land permanent, it gains you 2 life, and it creates a tapped Power Stone. If you can grab one of these, do it. Like I've said before, I'll happily pick this up, pack 1, pick 1, and I recommend you do the same. My other mythic level uncommon for Dimir is Thopter Mechanic. Just like in Izzet, you should have tons of card draw, so Thopter Mechanic can become massive. My tier 1 uncommon is the gold card Evangel of Synthesis. It goes pretty late, and you want as many of these as you can get. It triggers your second draw clause, and then it's a 3/3 menace each time you trigger your clause again. The menace might make you think it would be best in a tempo-based strategy, but I've found with a bunch of removal, it's not uncommon for my opponent to only have 1 creature, and for this to get in late in the game. Now for my tier 2 uncommons, I still want as many of these as I can get. Zephyr Sentinel is a mythic level uncommon in Azorius, but playing a 2/1 flash flyer that can help protect one of your few creatures that you have in Dimir from removal is great. Skyfisher Spider is a mythic level uncommon in Golgari, but it is definitely worth splashing in your Dimir deck. I want removal to control my opponent, and being able to remove any non-land permanent is great. It is also a 3/3 reach creature, which blocks most of the white flying commons, so it doubles as a great defensive card as well. Third Path Iconoclast is a mythic level uncommon in Izzet, but is worth splashing in your Dimir deck as well. I aim to have a large amount of non-creature spells, so this card can generate a ton of 1/1s. Hero of the Dunes is also worth splashing. So we have 3 gold cards that are all worth splashing, and that is why I really like playing Energy Refractor in my Dimir decks. This card works wonders with Gurgling Anointer, and you might have noticed that cards like Evangel of Synthesis and Stern Lesson draw you cards, but then you have to discard one. So Hero of the Dunes lets you discard a card that you plan on reanimating, and I've found it to work quite well in Dimir. My last tier 2 uncommon is Ashnod's Harvester. I've mentioned this card in every single guide that I've made. It can trade up defensively as a 3/1, and removing a card your opponent is planning to unearth or reanimate can be very important. Now for the tier 3 uncommons. Gurgling Anointer doesn't go very late, and it is a pity. You can do some really interesting reanimation loops with this card. You do need to be in Dimir, I think, because without card draw, this card is just mediocre. but it's a great defensive card as well since it has a 3 toughness. It blocks most of the white flyers in the set, and outside of this card being dependent on other cards in your deck, another thing that brings it down to tier 3 is that I don't tend to run very many creatures in Dimir. So you can make this card into a superstar, but it does take a bit of work. Mishra's research desk is also worth including, especially if you plan on splashing red. Even without the splash, I'd still run 1 or 2 since you're trying to cycle through your deck. The downside is this card doesn't count towards your second draw clause. Levitating Statue is better in Izzet, mostly because I plan to run tempo cards like Machine Over Matter, but since I plan on being mostly spells and I might have Mightstone animations, it's hard to say no to a turn 4, 5/5, or 6/6 flyer. My last tier 3 uncommon is Ichor Wellspring. It triggers the second draw clause. You don't have as many options to easily sacrifice it as you do in Rakdos, but hitting this with a Mightstone animation means that if it dies, you get to draw a card. Now for the rares. Gix's Command is a card that will put me towards playing an attrition strategy and is great in Dimir. You may not have the best creatures to dig up from your graveyard, which is why I like Gix's Command a little bit more in Golgari, but it is pretty hard to outvalue this card. You can use it to clear your opponent's board, you could use it to gain life. It is also important to have a late game card that you are stalling to in an attrition strategy with all of your removal, and I can't think of a better card. Sky Strike Officer is most broken in Azorius, but it still needs to be answered with removal in any blue deck. If this card goes unanswered, you also get a way to repetitively trigger your second draw clause. Precursor Golem is a great rare that performs quite well in many decks, but it performs the best in Dimir and Gruul. It's all about what you can hit this card with, and since it will copy the spell. And Mightstone Animation and Moment of Defiance definitely come to mind. You end up triggering it 3 times and drawing 3 cards. Absolutely fantastic. If you haven't had the opportunity to do it, I highly recommend trying it. Ashnod Flesh Mechanist performs best in Dimir. It's a great defensive card, and unless you plan to do a reanimation loop with Hero of the Dunes and Gurgling Anointer, the late game mana sink ability comes into play more than in any other archetype. As I've done in the past, I'll give a brief mention to some rares that are good to include, but tend to take my mind elsewhere if I open them up and pack one, pick one. Phyrexian Dragon Engine is a good inclusion since a 2/2 double strike is also a great blocker, but it's best in Boros. And Misery's Shadow is also a great inclusion, but I prefer it in Golgari and Orsov. As I mentioned in my previous guide, Gixian Puppeteer is a Rakdos superstar. I think it was intended for Dimir, and it does make your second draw clause drain for 2. It also pairs well with the Graveyard Reanimation strategy, as bringing back a Gurgling Anointer that then brings back another creature can be a lot for your opponent to deal with. Steel Seraph is also a good inclusion, but it's best in Celestia, and Simian Simulacrum, but I prefer it in Gruul. Mazemind Tome is great in Dimir. Being able to repetitively draw a card for 2 mana can trigger all of your second card effects, and the life gain can be nice to stabilize. I like it slightly more in Golgari, but it is worth a mention. Similarly, Transmigrant's Crown can be good for card draw, but since I prefer a strategy with fewer creatures in Dimir, I've found it to be better in Rakdos and Orsov. My last rare worth the spotlight is Underground River. Since you might find yourself splashing for some of the gold cards that I mentioned earlier in the guide, it can be nice to include a dual land so your mana base can be a little bit more flexible. Lastly, I'll mention Liberator versus Battlethopter, but it's best in Azorius, versus Command, which I find best in Izzet, and the Mightstone and Weakstone, which I find best in Azorius. Now for the mythics. Wormcoil Engine is great, but it is best in Golgari. Similarly, Cityscape Leveler is a broken card, but is best in Simic, where you can reliably plan on hitting its expensive casting cost. Surge Engine is a fine inclusion, but it is best in Izzet, where you can take advantage of the early pressure. And Portal to Phyrexia, which I find to be best in Simic, where you can aim to ramp to its expensive casting cost. Blade Coil Serpent, though, is a mythic that is best in Dimir. Since I'm trying to win through card advantage, there is no better feeling than drawing 1 or 2 and making my opponent discard 1 or 2. Teferi Temporal Pilgrim is best in Dimir. It fits the second draw strategy perfectly, since it both gets stronger the more cards that you draw, and it repetitively draws cards in and of itself. The third loyalty ability, too, is a very satisfying way to destroy any last hopes that your opponent may have. Gix Yawgmoth Praetor is right at home in Dimir, making it so that each unblocked creature triggers your second draw clause is great, and the late game mana sink is also a very satisfying way to win the game in your attrition strategy. Now for a mythic I would only play in Dimir, and only if I have other cards to support it. Arcane Proxy fits into the graveyard recursion strategy of Gixian Puppeteer, Gurgling Anointer, and Hero of the Dunes, but it takes a bit of work. You'll want to cast it for its prototype cost, and then hit a good 2-cost spell like Emergency Weld. It can be a little difficult to set up, but this allows you to get a creature back and to create a 1/1 token to further your graveyard recursion shenanigans. In closing, I'll give a brief mention to Saheeli. She is best in Izzet, but the draw ability fits into the Dimir strategy, and Phyrexian Fleshgorger, which is best in Golgari, but the life leak can work in stabilizing. Thank you for enjoying my drafting guide to Dimir. Remember to hit like and subscribe to help support me. I really do appreciate it. You can also catch me Monday through Friday at 2 p.m. Pacific, 5 p.m. Eastern on Twitch. We're down to only 2 more archetypes before the new set All Will Be One, available on Magic the Gathering Arena February 7th. Thank you all for the support, and I'll see you next week.